Two brothers disappeared without a trace in 1982, leaving their family shattered. But 40 years later, the police found something that makes everyone's blood run cold. The morning sun glinted off the crystal-clear waters of Lake Tahoe as David Reynolds patiently guided his 11-year-old son's hands. "That's it, Tommy. Loop it through just like that," he said, watching with pride as the boy's small fingers worked to tie the fishing hook. "Dad, is it right this time?" Tommy asked, his blue eyes squinting in concentration, blonde hair peeking from beneath his giant's baseball cap. Michael, Tommy's 9-year-old brother, leaned forward eagerly, his matching blue eyes wide with interest. "Show me next, Dad," he pleaded, his attention momentarily diverted from the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. "You'll get your turn, buddy," David laughed, ruffling Michael's identical blonde hair. "Fishing takes patience, remember?" The tranquil scene played out every Sunday morning, since the Reynolds family had moved to South Lake Tahoe 3 years ago, leaving the growing urban violence of San Francisco behind. Here, surrounded by towering pines and crisp mountain air, they had found the perfect place to raise their boys. Later that week, on a warm Thursday in June 1982, Susan Reynolds stood by the window of South Lake Tahoe General Hospital, gazing at the pine-covered mountains that embraced the small community. "Best decision we ever made was leaving San Francisco," she said to Marie, a fellow nurse who was reviewing patient charts at the station. "The boys can ride their bikes around the neighborhood, play until sunset. Try doing that in the city these days." Marie nodded in agreement. "This place is paradise, Susan. You're lucky your husband found work at the lumber company so quickly." In Miss Patterson's 5th-grade classroom that same morning, Tommy Reynolds bent over his desk, quietly explaining a math problem to his younger brother who had stopped by during recess. "See, Michael, you just have to remember to carry the 1, he explained patiently, their blonde heads together like matching bookends. Miss Patterson smiled at the scene. The Reynolds boys were inseparable. Tommy always looking out for his younger brother, Michael always trailing behind his older sibling with unwavering admiration. At lunchtime, Michael raced ahead across their neat front yard where Susan was hanging laundry, the scent of freshly baked apple pie wafting through the open kitchen window. "Mom, did you make pie?" he called out, his Schwinn bicycle abandoned hastily on the lawn. "For after dinner," Susan laughed, gathering her youngest into a quick hug. "Wash up, both of you. Sandwiches are on the table." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as the boys helped Mr. Peterson, their elderly neighbor, water his prize-winning roses. The 78-year-old widower delighted in their company, regaling them with stories of how South Lake Tahoe looked decades earlier. "Before all these houses, this was all forest, boys," he explained, his weathered hands carefully pruning a vibrant red bloom. "Bears would walk right through where your house stands now." By 4 o'clock, the boys had finished their chores and homework. They stood in the kitchen, hopeful expressions on their faces, as Susan prepared dinner. "Mom, can we have some money for candy?" Michael asked, practically bouncing with anticipation. "We want a ride to Whitefeather Market." Susan hesitated briefly, then reached for her purse. "Be back before dinner," she instructed, handing Tommy 2 crisp $1 bills. "Your father's bringing pizza tonight." Tommy carefully tucked the money into his pocket, adjusting his giant's cap. "We'll just get candy and come right back, Mom. Promise." "Half hour tops," he added, already halfway out the door where Michael was impatiently circling on his new blue Schwinn. Susan watched from the porch as her sons pedaled down Pinecrest Avenue, waving to Mrs. Grantham who was tending her garden. Tommy rode carefully, stopping at the corner as he'd been taught, while Michael performed small figure eights, showing off his improving skills. At 5:30, David Reynolds pulled into the driveway, 2 large pizza boxes balanced in one hand as he pushed open the front door. "I'm home, boys, pizza's here," he called out, setting the boxes on the kitchen counter. Susan looked up from the salad she was preparing. "They're not back yet?" "From where?" David asked, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "They went to Whitefeather for candy, about an hour and a half ago." A small furrow appeared between Susan's brows. "They should have been back by now." David dried his hands on a dish towel. Probably got distracted. You know how they are when they get talking to their friends. By 6:15, with the pizza cooling untouched on the counter, David grabbed his car keys. "I'll drive over to the store and find them," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, despite the growing knot of concern in his stomach. Driving slowly down Pinecrest Avenue in his Ford Bronco, David scanned the groups of children playing in front yards. He stopped beside a cluster of boys shooting baskets in a driveway. "Hey, have any of you seen Tommy and Michael today?" The children shook their heads. "Not since school, Mr. Reynolds," one boy offered. At White Feather Market, the small bell above the door jangled as David entered. Jerry Carmichael, the teenage clerk, looked up from his magazine. "Evening, Mr. Reynolds." "Jerry, have you seen my boys today?" David asked, his voice tight. The young man nodded. "Yeah, they were in around 4:30, bought some Twinkies and Cokes." His expression changed as he glanced toward the counter. "Actually, that's weird. They paid but never picked up their stuff. I figured they'd come back for it." David's heart began to pound as he walked outside to the small gravel parking area. There, leaning neatly against the side wall just as he had taught them, were Tommy's red bike and Michael's new blue Schwinn. His world tilted sharply as he stared at the abandoned bicycles. Something was terribly wrong. Children might forget candy, but never their beloved bikes. Back inside, Jerry pointed to 2 Twinkie packages and 2 unopened Coca-Cola cans sitting on the counter. They were super excited about getting these. I thought it was strange when they didn't come back to get them. By 7:30 that evening, Susan paced the living room, tears streaming silently down her face as she clutched the phone to her ear. "They're good boys. They would never just wander off," she explained to the sheriff's office, her voice breaking. "Tommy is very responsible. He always watches out for his brother." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Jim Donovan arrived personally at the Reynolds home, accompanied by 2 deputies. The 51-year-old lawman's expression was grave but compassionate as he took detailed notes, while Susan showed him a recent school camping photo of the boys. Outside, patrol cars with flashing lights illuminated the rapidly darkening neighborhood as volunteers with flashlights began forming search parties. David stood with Deputy Mercer by the Bronco, his face ashen. "They would never do this," he insisted. "Never disappear like this. Something's happened to them." As search teams spread through the surrounding forest, Sheriff Donovan's radio crackled. The information coming through made his weathered face harden instantly. An elderly woman living near the market had just reported seeing the Reynolds boys getting into a large dark car with a man wearing what appeared to be a security guard's uniform. Sheriff Donovan's face hardened as he listened to the radio transmission. He motioned for his deputy to take notes while keeping his voice deliberately low, aware of Susan and David's anxious presence nearby. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitman just called in," he explained to the Reynolds, his weathered face grave. "She lives in the blue house across from White Feather Market. Says she saw your boys getting into a dark vehicle with someone wearing what looked like a security uniform." Susan gasped, clutching David's arm. "A security guard? From where?" Within the hour, Sheriff Donovan had dispatched deputies to Mrs. Whitman's home. The 76-year-old woman welcomed the officers into her living room, where 3 cats prowled between antique furniture. "I was watering my window plants when I saw them," she explained, adjusting her glasses. 2 blonde boys, just like in the photo. The car was big, dark, navy blue or black, I think. And the man definitely wore a uniform, like those security guards have. Didn't think anything of it until I heard the commotion outside. By midnight, the small sheriff's station had transformed into a bustling command center. Maps of the Lake Tahoe area covered the walls, red pins marking where the boys were last seen. Outside, the whir of helicopter blades announced the arrival of federal assistance. Special Agent Robert Lawson strode through the station doors, his 42-year-old frame rigid in a precisely pressed FBI suit. He shook hands with Sheriff Donovan before introducing himself to the Reynolds. "The first 48 hours are critical in cases like this," Lawson explained, his tone professional yet compassionate as they gathered in the conference room. Susan gripped David's hand tightly as the agent continued. "We're establishing roadblocks on all exits from the area, and we'll be conducting door-to-door interviews throughout South Lake Tahoe." David's face paled as Lawson shared statistics on child disappearances, information that confirmed his worst fears while offering the slimmest hope that quick action might make a difference. Early the next morning, search teams with tracking dogs combed the forests surrounding the Whitefeather Market. The lead handler frowned as his German Shepherd circled the area where the bicycles had been found. "The trail ends right here in the parking lot," he told Sheriff Donovan. "Dogs can't pick up anything beyond this point, which strongly suggests they left in a vehicle." At the market, David reviewed the employee list with the owner, Al Thompson, a balding man in his 50s, who had operated the store for nearly 20 years. "Everyone's accounted for except Gerald Walker," Thompson said, pointing to a name halfway down the list. "He's our part-time security guy, usually works evenings. Didn't show up for his shift today. I tried calling, but no answer." Within the hour, FBI agents were at Walker's registered address, a sparsely furnished one-bedroom apartment in a modest complex on the edge of town. The landlady let them in with a spare key, revealing bare walls, minimal furniture, and an empty closet. The few remaining items suggested someone had left in a hurry. "Looks like he cleared out," one agent remarked, snapping photographs of the space. "Let's get forensics in here, ASAP." While one team focused on Walker, another interviewed Harold Cooper, a 67-year-old retired fisherman who had called the tip line. "I was checking my boat at the North Dock around 4:45 yesterday," Cooper explained, his weathered hands gripping a coffee mug. "Saw two blonde boys walking with an older man toward the picnic area trail. Figured it was their father or uncle. They weren't struggling or anything." Back at the Reynolds home, Susan sat on Tommy's bed, clutching two identical teddy bears, Christmas gifts from the previous year. A female officer gently asked questions about distinguishing marks, birthmarks, or recent injuries that might help identify the boys. "Michael has a small scar above his right eyebrow from falling off his bike last summer," Susan whispered, her finger tracing the same spot on her own face. "And Tommy has a freckle pattern on his left shoulder that looks like the Big Dipper. I always told him it was his special constellation." Throughout South Lake Tahoe, citizens mobilized with remarkable speed. Store owners displayed missing persons posters in their windows. Volunteers distributed flyers at gas stations and restaurants. Local church groups organized prayer vigils. The small community, shocked that such a tragedy could touch their idyllic town, rallied around the Reynolds family. FBI agents methodically examined the Reynolds phone records, interviewing relatives and friends about potential custody disputes or family conflicts. David and Susan, their faces drawn with exhaustion, repeatedly assured investigators there was no one who would want to harm their family. By late afternoon, authorities had established checkpoints on Interstate 50 in both directions, creating long lines of vehicles under the blazing sun. Officers checked cars and trucks, particularly focusing on vans and larger vehicles that could conceal passengers. That evening, a tense meeting took place at the command center. Lawson and Donovan stood before a large whiteboard displaying a timeline of events, photographs of the boys, and potential suspect information, including the limited details about Gerald Walker. "We have conflicting eyewitness accounts," Lawson noted, tapping the locations on a map. "Mrs. Whitman saw them getting into a car at the market. Mr. Cooper saw them walking toward the lake. Both can't be right unless we're dealing with mistaken identity in one case." At dawn the following day, David drove his Bronco slowly along the lakeshore, stopping every jogger and early morning fisherman he encountered. "Have you seen these boys?" he asked repeatedly, holding out the school photograph, his eyes pleading for information no one seemed to have. The afternoon brought a potential breakthrough when a search team radioed in from the North Shore. "We've found a blue children's sneaker in the vegetation near the old picnic grounds," the team leader reported, size matching the younger boys. When Susan arrived to identify the item, the color drained from her face. "That's Michael's," she gasped, before collapsing into David's arms. Sheriff Donovan carefully placed the sneaker in an evidence bag while paramedics attended to Susan. As the medical team monitored Susan's vital signs, a forensic technician examined the sneaker under a portable magnifier. After several minutes, he beckoned Agent Lawson to a corner of the room, speaking in hushed tones. "Sir, this sneaker has the same model and size as the one described by the parents, but the wear pattern is inconsistent with only a few months of use. It appears to have been deliberately placed here to mislead us." Agent Lawson studied the blue sneaker under the fluorescent lights of the FBI's mobile forensic lab. "The wear pattern suggests this has been exposed to the elements much longer than the 3 days since the boys disappeared," he explained to Sheriff Donovan, pointing to specific areas of degradation. "Whoever placed it here wanted us to find it." Donovan's weathered face tightened with frustration. "So it's a deliberate false lead. Someone's playing games with us." The revelation that the sneaker had been planted devastated Susan when she was finally told. After being treated for shock by paramedics, she sat motionless at the kitchen table that evening, staring at untouched plates of food that neighbors had brought over. David hovered nearby, his own hand trembling as he attempted to coax her to eat something. "Just a few bites, Susan. You need your strength," he whispered, his voice cracking. She looked through him rather than at him. "How could someone do this? Give us hope and then—" Her words trailed off into silence. Later that night, after Susan had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep with the help of mild sedatives, David slipped into the garage. Sitting on an overturned bucket, he pulled a whiskey bottle from behind the toolbox and drank directly from it, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs as he stared at the fishing rods hanging on the wall, the smaller ones he had bought for the boys just 3 months earlier. At the sheriff's station, Agent Lawson hunched over a desk, reviewing grainy footage from the only security camera in South Lake Tahoe, located at the local bank 2 blocks from Whitefeather Market. The black and white images showed normal street traffic, but the angle failed to capture the area where Mrs. Whitman claimed to have seen the dark vehicle. "Any luck?" Sheriff Donovan asked, placing a cup of coffee beside the agent. Lawson shook his head. "Camera doesn't cover that section of street. We're blind there." The following morning, Donovan personally interviewed Jerry Carmichael, the young store clerk, hoping fresh questioning might yield overlooked details. "Think hard, Jerry. Anything unusual about the boys' behavior that day?" The teenager furrowed his brow in concentration. "They seemed normal, excited even. Tommy was telling Michael they were almost done saving up for an Atari game. Something about Space Invaders, I think." By the end of the first week, county dive teams had thoroughly searched the waters near the North Dock, where Mr. Cooper reported seeing the boys. Their efforts yielded nothing but common lake bed debris and an old bicycle tire that had clearly been submerged for years. In the Reynolds home, Susan had begun obsessively organizing the boys' bedroom, ensuring every toy was perfectly aligned on shelves, beds meticulously made with hospital corners. "Tommy likes his Star Wars figures arranged by movie appearance," she explained to a concerned neighbor who had stopped by with groceries, "and Michael's dinosaurs need to be in size order. They'll notice if things are out of place when they come home." The national media's initial intense coverage had begun to wane. Where 3 television vans had crowded the street outside the Reynolds home days earlier, now only a local reporter remained, interviewing residents about the community's response to the tragedy. At the command center, tension mounted between local and federal authorities as the investigation stalled. Sheriff Donovan slapped a folder onto the conference table. Walker's background check came back clean. No criminal record, positive employment references, no red flags, he reported with evident frustration. "Doesn't fit the profile of someone who would abduct children." Agent Lawson rubbed his tired eyes. "And yet he disappears the same day as the boys. That's not coincidence." 9 days after the disappearance, Lawson sat with the Reynolds in their living room, carefully managing expectations about the investigation's next phase. "We're transferring some resources back to our Sacramento office," he explained gently. "But I want to assure you, the case remains priority. We'll have agents dedicated to following leads as they develop." Susan nodded mechanically, her fingers absently tracing the edges of a photograph album open on her lap. She had lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. She paused at a Christmas photo of the boys holding their identical teddy bears, matching gap-toothed smiles beaming at the camera. David had taken to visiting local bars at night, showing photos of the boys to strangers after Susan went to bed. With each passing day, he returned home later and more intoxicated, his hope visibly diminishing alongside his sobriety. On the 10th day, a young FBI agent named Richards was reviewing initial reports when she noticed a troubling oversight. "Sir," she approached Lawson, pointing to a notation on one document, "it says here we were supposed to check security cameras at the gas station on Interstate 50, but there's no follow-up. Was this ever completed?" Lawson frowned, quickly checking the master evidence log. "Must have fallen through the cracks during the initial chaos. Get a team out there immediately." 2 hours later, the agents returned with a videotape. The footage from the Shell station, located 7 miles east of South Lake Tahoe on Interstate 50, showed a dark blue Plymouth Fury pulling in for gas at 4:50 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, just 20 minutes after the boys had vanished. As the team enhanced and slowed the grainy footage, they could clearly see a man in what appeared to be a security uniform exiting the vehicle to pump gas. The camera angle partially captured the license plate, J7K. Most disturbing was a brief moment when what looked like a small, pale arm appeared in the rear window before being quickly pulled back inside. "That's them," Lawson said, his voice tight with renewed urgency. "And now we have part of a plate number and confirmation of the vehicle. Get this to every law enforcement agency within 500 miles. We're looking for a dark blue Plymouth Fury with a partial plate J7K." The discovery of the Plymouth Fury and the gas station footage electrified the investigation. Agent Lawson immediately assembled his team, projecting the enhanced images onto the station's main screen. Specialists magnified the partial license plate, J7K, visible for just a few frames as the vehicle pulled away from the pump. "Run every possible combination with this partial plate through the DMV databases for California and Nevada," Lawson ordered. "Focus on dark blue Plymouth Furies registered within a 100-mile radius." By morning, the database search had yielded promising results. A blue Plymouth Fury with license plate JCL7K3 had been reported stolen from an elderly resident of Carson City 2 weeks before the boys' disappearance. The owner is Harold Winters, 74, retired schoolteacher, the Carson City detective explained over the phone to Lawson. "Says he barely drove the car anymore, kept it mostly in his garage. Didn't even notice it was missing until his daughter visited and asked where it was." This connection created the first solid lead since the boys had vanished. Sheriff Donovan assembled search teams to monitor highways and back roads connecting South Lake Tahoe with Carson City, focusing particularly on isolated properties where someone might conceal a vehicle and 2 children. Meanwhile, a separate FBI team delved deeper into Gerald Walker's background. Their investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. The convenience store in Reno, where Walker claimed to have worked for 2 years, had no record of his employment. "No one by that name ever worked here," the manager confirmed, reviewing personnel files. "We keep records going back 5 years. No Gerald Walker." Similar inquiries at other previous employers listed on Walker's application to Whitefeather Market yielded the same results: vague recollections or no records at all. His references, when contacted, provided suspiciously similar glowing recommendations, but seemed unable to offer specific anecdotes about their supposed former employee. At home, Susan and David's relationship deteriorated further. Late that night, after another day without breakthroughs, their whispered conversation escalated into a bitter argument. "You never should have let them go alone," David hissed, whiskey evident on his breath. "They were too young to be out by themselves." Susan's face contorted with rage and grief. "And where were you? Working late as always. I've been raising these boys practically by myself while you—" She broke off, sobbing, then fled to the boys' bedroom, where she curled up on Tommy's bed, clutching both teddy bears against her chest. David watched from the doorway, devastation etched on his face, before retreating to the living room couch. By the end of the second week, Agent Lawson noticed discrepancies between Walker's driver's license photograph and descriptions provided by people who had known him. The license showed a man with a prominent nose and receding hairline, while co-workers described someone with a rounder face and fuller hair. He may have been using altered identification, Lawson theorized during a briefing. We need to circulate both the DMV photo and a composite based on witness descriptions. On the 16th day after the disappearance, an FBI forensic artist sat with David and Susan, creating projections of how Tommy and Michael might appear if their appearances were altered, hair dyed, different clothing styles, even glasses as potential disguises. Children's appearances can be changed relatively easily, the artist explained gently as she sketched. These images will help us identify them, even if their appearance has been modified. Susan stared at the progressively changing faces of her sons on the artist's pad, her expression hollow. "They're still my boys underneath," she whispered, "no matter what he's done to them." That Sunday, 1 month after the disappearance, the church that the Reynolds family had attended held a special prayer service. The pews were noticeably emptier than during the first vigil weeks earlier. Life in South Lake Tahoe was gradually returning to normal for everyone except the Reynolds and those closest to them. Susan ventured out for the first time in days to visit Whitefeather Market, determined to retrace her son's last known steps. As she stood frozen in the candy aisle, 2 blonde boys about Tommy and Michael's age entered the store, laughing and counting coins. The similarity triggered an immediate panic attack. Store owner Al Thompson gently guided her outside to a bench, where she struggled to breathe through her sobs. "I thought it was them," she gasped. "Just for a second, I thought they'd come back." The investigation into Walker's identity gained momentum when agents discovered the Social Security number he had used belonged to a man who had died 10 years earlier in Arizona. This discovery confirmed their suspicions that Gerald Walker was likely an alias. Sheriff Donovan found himself escorting an intoxicated David home after breaking up a bar fight. David had punched a local construction worker who had insensitively suggested that those boys are probably dead by now. "He had no right to say that," David slurred as Donovan helped him into the house. "No goddamn right." Susan began keeping a diary, writing letters to her missing sons. "Day 34 without you," one entry began. "Michael, you would have loved the new E.T. movie everyone's talking about. I'm saving ticket money for when you come home." As the search scaled back to weekend volunteers and the FBI presence diminished, Agent Lawson delivered a detailed report to the Reynolds, explaining the transition to long-term investigation status. "This doesn't mean we're giving up," he assured them. "It means we're settling in for the long haul." While looking through employee records from Walker's previous jobs, FBI analysts made a disturbing discovery. 3 months before beginning work at Whitefeather Market, Walker had briefly worked at a convenience store in Auburn, California. During his employment there, 2 blonde brothers aged 10 and 8 had disappeared while walking home from school. Their case remained unsolved and had never been connected to the Reynolds investigation. The discovery of the Auburn connection sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Agent Lawson immediately ordered a conference room set up at the FBI's Sacramento field office. Its walls soon covered with maps showing Interstate 50 with red pins marking each location where similar disappearances had occurred. "We've identified 5 cases of missing blonde children between 1975 and 1982, all along this corridor," Lawson explained to the expanded team of agents. Each disappearance occurred within weeks of Walker, or someone using a similar identity, taking employment in the area. The pattern was undeniable. Children vanishing near small businesses where a nondescript man briefly worked before moving on. No bodies ever recovered, no ransom demands. Just empty spaces where once there had been laughing children. A disturbing image emerged as Lawson displayed a grainy school photograph from Auburn, taken in the spring of 1981. 2 blonde brothers, ages 8 and 10, walked past a convenience store where a man in a dark uniform watched from the doorway. "This was taken 3 weeks before they disappeared," Lawson noted grimly. "The store clerk in the doorway matches descriptions of Walker." Back at the Reynolds home, Susan discovered David's secret. While searching for tax documents in his office, she found 3 empty whiskey bottles hidden behind reference books on his shelves. That evening, she confronted him, holding the evidence of his growing alcoholism. "How do you expect me to handle this sober?" David shouted, his face flushed with shame and anger. "Every morning I wake up hoping it was all a nightmare, and every morning it's real again." Susan's voice was brittle with exhaustion. "I'm suffering too, David, but drowning yourself won't bring them back." The following day, Susan watched silently from their bedroom doorway as David packed a suitcase, folding shirts with mechanical precision. Neither spoke as he zipped the bag closed. Words had become insufficient vessels for their grief. "I'll be at Kevin's place," he finally said, referring to a co-worker who had offered his spare room. "I'll still help with the search efforts. I can't be here right now." After David left, Susan transformed their garage into an investigation headquarters. She parked their car on the street, now permanently covered in dust and pollen. Inside, she meticulously arranged newspaper clippings, maps, and photographs on pegboards. Red yarn connected events, locations, and potential suspects. What had begun as a temporary project quickly became an obsession, her way of maintaining control when everything else had spiraled beyond her grasp. Sheriff Donovan, who had aged visibly since the investigation began, reviewed the new information about similar disappearances with growing dismay. Gray now dominated his once salt and pepper hair, deep lines etched around his eyes. "How did we miss this connection with Auburn?" he asked the FBI agent who had discovered the pattern. "It was right under our noses the whole time." At the public library, Susan spent hours poring over microfiche archives of regional newspapers, searching for any mention of similar cases. The librarian, Mrs. Halsey, helped her navigate the unwieldy machines and retrieve archived newsreels dating back to 1970. "I've worked here for 30 years, Mrs. Halsey confided quietly. "And I remember other cases like yours, children who just vanished. Let me show you the files I've kept." Meanwhile, David attended his first support group for parents of missing children in Carson City. He sat silently through most of the meeting, jaw clenched against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. When Frank Miller, a father whose son had been missing for 6 years, described still buying birthday presents each year and storing them in a closet for when Jason comes home, David finally broke down, shoulders heaving with released grief. FBI agents traveled to Auburn to interview the parents of the missing brothers. When shown Walker's DMV photograph, Mrs. Jenkins gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's him, the man from the convenience store," she confirmed. "The boys used to stop there after school for candy. He always gave them extra, said they reminded him of his nephews." On the morning marking 1 year since the disappearance, Susan entered the boys' bedroom carrying 2 carefully wrapped packages. She placed them at the foot of each bed, a model airplane kit for Tommy and a plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex for Michael. "I know you'll want these when you come home," she whispered to the empty room. Later that day, a small ceremony was held in South Lake Tahoe's Central Park. Approximately 50 people gathered around a newly planted pine tree dedicated to the missing Reynolds brothers. Susan and David sat on opposite sides of the small crowd, their shared grief now experienced separately. Agent Lawson, officially reassigned to other cases, but still deeply invested in finding the Reynolds boys, visited Susan on his day off. "I promise you, I won't let this case be forgotten," he told her earnestly. "I've set up automatic alerts for any activity matching our parameters." Throughout the summer, Susan drove the Interstate 50 corridor regularly, stopping at every gas station and convenience store to distribute updated posters with the age progression sketches. Some store owners recognized her from previous visits, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and awkward discomfort. In his sparse Carson City apartment, David fell asleep surrounded by photographs of his sons, an empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside the couch. On the television, a home video from Christmas 2 years earlier played on loop. Tommy and Michael tearing open presents, their excited voices now haunting the empty room. Late one night in her garage command center, Susan discovered a newspaper clipping she had overlooked about a blonde child found wandering alone near Placerville in 1979. The boy, approximately 7 years old, had been unable to explain how he became separated from his family. Unlike the other children, this one had somehow escaped. On Christmas Eve 1983, 18 months after the disappearance, a package without a return address arrived at the Reynolds home. Susan opened it with trembling hands to find 2 teddy bears identical to those the boys had owned, each with a small handwritten tag that read simply, "Still alive." Susan stared at the teddy bears in her hands, identical to the ones Tommy and Michael had received for Christmas the year before they vanished. The handwritten tags, "Still alive," sent electric shocks through her body. With trembling fingers, she reached for the phone and dialed Sheriff Donovan's number, barely able to relay what she had found. Within an hour, the Reynolds living room buzzed with activity. FBI forensic technicians photographed the package and teddy bears from every angle, carefully examining the handwriting on the tags and checking for fingerprints or DNA evidence. "These appear to be newly purchased, not the original bears," noted a technician, pointing to the manufacturing tags. "The stitching pattern is slightly different from the ones in your family photos." The front door burst open as David rushed in, his face flushed from the cold December air. For the first time in months, he embraced Susan, both of them gravitating toward the kitchen table, where the bears sat under the scrutinizing gaze of investigators. "Could it really be them?" Susan whispered, her voice catching. "Could they really be alive somewhere?" Agent Lawson arrived from Sacramento the next morning, immediately ordering an investigation into the package's origin. A team dispatched to the Reno post office showed Walker's photograph to postal workers, generating a vague recollection from one employee. "Yeah, I remember an older guy, maybe wearing a cap," the postal clerk said, scratching his chin. "Mailed several packages about a week ago. Paid cash, didn't say much." That night, Susan and David sat at the kitchen table long after the investigators had left, coffee cups cooling between them as they contemplated what the bears might mean. The wall clock ticked past midnight, but neither felt the pull of sleep. "They'd be 12 and 10 now," Susan said, staring at the bears. "Tommy would be almost a teenager. I wonder if his voice has started changing." David's eyes, clear and sober for the first time in months, reflected the kitchen light. "We don't know for sure this is legitimate, Susan. We need to prepare ourselves that this might be someone's cruel idea of a joke." The following day, Lawson convened a meeting with the Reynolds and Sheriff Donovan to discuss all possibilities. "We have to consider 3 scenarios," he explained, his tone measured. 1. The boys are alive and being held somewhere. 2. Someone who knows something about their fate is sending a message. 3. This is the work of a hoaxer who's followed the case through media coverage. Susan clutched one of the bears against her chest, refusing to relinquish it for extended laboratory analysis. That night, she slept with both bears, pressing them to her face and inhaling deeply, searching for any scent that might belong to her sons, rather than a department store shelf. At his Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in Carson City, David shared his conflicted emotions with the group. "I don't know if this message is real," he admitted, gripping the edge of his chair. "But it's given me a reason to stay sober. If there's even a chance my boys are out there, I need to be clear-headed when they come home." National attention returned to the case in January, when America's Most Wanted featured the Reynolds brothers. Television crews transformed the living room into a makeshift studio, cameras trained on Susan and David as they recounted their ordeal for millions of viewers. "Someone knows what happened to our sons," Susan pleaded directly into the camera. "Please, if you've seen Tommy or Michael, or if you know anything at all, call the number on your screen." The special hotline installed in the Reynolds home began ringing almost immediately after the segment aired. FBI agents worked in shifts, documenting each call, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Over 200 leads poured in within 48 hours. Susan and David spent days reviewing reports of potential sightings. A couple in Portland who spotted two blonde boys at a supermarket. A waitress in Phoenix who served a man with two uncomfortable-looking children. A truck driver who glimpsed similar-looking boys at a rest stop in Northern California. "We need to follow up on every single one," Susan insisted, sorting the reports into geographical piles. "One of these could lead us to them." The FBI dispatched agents to investigate the most credible sightings. In Portland, the team located the family whose sons had been mistaken for the Reynolds boys, confirming they were local children with no connection to the case. As the initial surge of optimism began to fade, David gradually returned to his carpentry work, now as an independent contractor. He kept photographs of Tommy and Michael in his toolbox, occasionally showing them to clients who recognized him from the television program. "If you hear anything, even if it seems unimportant, please call this number," he would say, handing out cards with the FBI hotline. The emotional toll of the renewed hope and subsequent disappointments created new tensions between Susan and David. One evening, after another promising lead had evaporated, their frustration erupted into a heated argument. "How can you just go back to work like everything's normal?" Susan demanded. "Those bears prove they're alive. We should be out there searching every day." David's response was measured, his newfound sobriety bringing a calmness that only seemed to inflame Susan's anger. "We need to consider all possibilities, Susan. The bears might be real, or they might not be. We can't put our entire lives on hold indefinitely." Susan's expression hardened. "My life stopped the day they disappeared. I won't rest until I find them." Each night, Susan placed the teddy bears on her pillow, writing in her journal by lamplight. "It's been 2 years since you went for candy," she wrote. "The bears we received are a sign. I will find you both, no matter how long it takes." In the spring of 1984, nearly 2 years after the disappearance, a fisherman in northern Lake Tahoe made a disturbing discovery in the deep waters. When authorities showed Susan the waterlogged blue backpack emblazoned with the Los Angeles Dodgers logo, she gasped in recognition. "It's Michael's," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "He took it everywhere with him." Behind her, dive teams were already preparing to search the area for what everyone feared they might find. The discovery of Michael's backpack triggered an immediate, intensive search operation. At dawn the next morning, a team of county divers sliced through the frigid waters of Lake Tahoe, their underwater flashlights creating eerie blue beams that penetrated the crystal-clear depths. From the shoreline, Susan and David watched in tense silence, her hand unconsciously seeking his for the first time in months. "We'll search the entire area systematically," the dive team leader assured them. "The water's exceptionally clear here. Visibility is about 60 feet. The waterlogged backpack lay in an evidence bag on a folding table, water still dripping from its saturated fabric. Though faded from exposure, the Los Angeles Dodgers logo remained unmistakable against the blue material. Susan had identified it immediately. Michael had carried it everywhere, despite his brother's constant teasing about supporting their baseball rivals. At the forensic lab later that day, Susan ran her fingers across the plastic evidence bag, recognizing the sodden contents. "That's his notebook. See his name on the cover? And Rexy?" Her voice caught as she identified the small plastic dinosaur. "He called it his lucky charm, said it would protect him from monsters." While Susan identified the items, the dive team continued their methodical grid search of the lake bottom. They communicated through hand signals, meticulously covering each section before moving to the next. After 6 hours in the water, the lead diver surfaced to report to Sheriff Donovan. "Nothing but rocks and lake vegetation down there," he said, removing his mask. "No clothing, no remains, no other personal effects." As darkness fell, the search was suspended until morning. David sat alone on a rocky outcropping at the shore, rhythmically tossing pebbles into the water. The soft splashes punctuated the evening silence until Sheriff Donovan approached, lowering himself with a grunt beside David. "What does it mean?" David asked without looking up. "Just the backpack," Nothing else? Donovan sighed heavily. Hard to say. The forensic team can't determine how long it was in the water. Could have been there since the disappearance, or someone could have placed it there more recently. Back at the house, the discovery sparked a heated confrontation in the kitchen. Susan slammed her hand on the counter as David suggested what seemed increasingly obvious to him. "Why can't you see what's right in front of you, Susan? They're not coming back," he shouted, his face flushed. "Then why haven't they found bodies?" she countered, eyes flashing. "Why just the backpack? If someone killed them, why leave just that one thing to be found?" The next morning, David continued packing his belongings, filling cardboard boxes with books and clothing. His friend Kevin helped load them into a pickup truck, casting concerned glances as David methodically emptied his closet. "I can't live with ghosts anymore," David explained quietly. "She's turned the house into a shrine. The boys are frozen in time in there, their toothbrushes still in the bathroom, pajamas still folded under their pillows." Susan spent the afternoon in her garage command center, pinning a photograph of the recovered backpack to her investigation board. With red marker, she circled the area of the lake where it had been found, drawing lines to other potential locations, creating complex theories about what might have happened. At the sheriff's station, Donovan presented new protocols for missing children cases to his deputies. The wall behind him displayed a flow chart of required actions, many implemented as direct results of lessons learned from the Reynolds investigation. "Immediate response is now mandatory," he emphasized. "DNA collection within the first 24 hours, verification of all security cameras within a 20-mile radius, and comprehensive background checks on anyone with access to the child." In Carson City, David signed a lease for a small one-bedroom apartment near his new workshop. The property manager recognized him from the news coverage, but tactfully avoided mentioning the case, instead focusing on practical matters like parking regulations and garbage collection days. Throughout the following weeks, Susan made daily pilgrimages to the spot where Michael's backpack had been recovered. She would sit for hours on a weathered bench overlooking the water, watching the lake as if it might eventually surrender more secrets. Joggers and tourists passed by, some recognizing her from newspaper photographs, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. In his new apartment, David carefully placed a single framed photograph of the boys on his bedside table. Tommy with his arm around Michael's shoulders, both grinning widely on a fishing trip. The remaining family photos he packed into a cardboard box and slid under his bed, unable to display them, but equally unable to discard them. Each night, Susan returned to sleeping in the boys' bedroom, now with Michael's dried backpack placed carefully beside the bed. She would run her fingers over the fabric before turning out the light, as if performing a ritual that might somehow summon its owner home. Sheriff Donovan, his hair now completely gray, spent an evening reviewing the Reynolds file one final time before reluctantly reclassifying it. With a heavy sigh, he placed the thick folder into a cabinet drawer labeled "Active Cases, Reduced Priority," his weathered face reflecting the frustration of a mystery that had consumed 5 years of his professional life and would likely haunt him into retirement. 5 years after the disappearance, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in 1987, Susan received a phone call that made her heart race. A woman with a soft Nevada accent introduced herself as Marion Keller from Reno, explaining she had recently seen the age progression photos of Tommy and Michael on a rebroadcast of America's Most Wanted. "I think I had your boys," the woman said hesitantly. "Between 82 and 84, 2 blonde boys lived with me. A man who said he was their uncle brought them to me after their mother supposedly died in an accident." Susan gripped the phone tighter, but it was the woman's next words that made her hand go numb, the receiver clattering to the floor. "The older one was always protecting the younger one. Once I caught him crying, looking at a torn photograph that seemed to be taken near a lake." Susan's trembling fingers fumbled to retrieve the fallen phone, her heart thundering in her chest. "Hello? Are you still there?" she gasped, clutching the receiver with both hands. "Yes, I'm here," Marion Keller replied. "Did I say something wrong?" No, Susan assured her, fighting to keep her voice steady. Can you tell me more about these boys? What were their names? How old were they? Within hours, Susan had scribbled pages of notes, documenting every detail provided by Keller. The woman described two blonde brothers who called themselves Tommy and Mike, though she believed these might have been aliases. Her description of their mannerisms matched her son's with uncanny precision. Tommy's habit of double-checking doors were locked before bedtime. Michael's tendency to sleep curled around his stuffed dinosaur. That evening, Susan drove to Carson City, exceeding the speed limit as she rehearsed what to tell David. She found him in his workshop, sanding a cabinet door. When she showed him her notes, he studied them with obvious skepticism. "Susan, we've been through this before," he said gently. "Remember the sightings after the TV show? None of them panned out." "This is different," she insisted, tapping her notebook. She knows about Michael's scar, the one above his eyebrow, and how Tommy always slept between Michael and the door. That wasn't in any news reports. The following morning, David reluctantly drove to Reno, arriving at Marion Keller's address shortly after 11. The modest home needed paint and minor repairs, but the garden showed signs of careful tending. Susan was already there, her car parked haphazardly in the driveway. Inside, Marion Keller, a thin woman in her late 50s with prematurely gray hair, served tea in mismatched cups. "They stayed in this room," she explained, leading them to a small bedroom at the back of the house. The older one always insisted on taking the bed near the door, like he was standing guard. Susan pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling. This matched Tommy's protective behavior exactly. Agent Lawson, called back to the case, arrived that afternoon to conduct a formal interview. Recording the conversation, he methodically questioned Keller about when and how the boys had arrived at her home. "It was June of '82, she recalled. "A man in his 40s said he was their uncle, told me their mother had died in a car accident and their father couldn't care for them. He offered to pay me monthly to look after them while he worked on oil rigs." "Can you describe this man?" Lawson asked. "Tall, thin, dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore glasses sometimes, but I think they were just for show. He seemed practiced, if that makes sense, like someone playing a role." While Keller's story captivated Susan, FBI agents quietly investigated her background. A field agent in the Reno office made discreet inquiries at local hospitals and uncovered a troubling history, multiple psychiatric admissions over the past decade, with diagnoses including delusional disorder and pathological confabulation. Susan, meanwhile, transformed her hotel room into a miniature version of her garage war room. She taped maps to the wall, creating a new timeline incorporating Keller's information, her eyes bright with renewed hope. The investigation's momentum slowed the following day when agents began interviewing Keller's neighbors. 80-year-old Margaret Wilson, who had lived next door for 30 years, shook her head firmly when shown photographs of the Reynolds boys. "I've never seen these children," she stated confidently, "and I would know. I can see her backyard from my kitchen window. Marion's always been imaginative, always talking about children staying with her, but I've never seen any children there." Other neighbors provided similar accounts, leaving Lawson with the difficult task of confronting Keller about the inconsistencies. During their second interview, gentle but persistent questioning revealed contradictions in her timeline. When presented with evidence that she'd been hospitalized during parts of the period she claimed to have the boys, her story began unraveling. "Sometimes the TV shows feel so real," she finally admitted, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I watch the missing children's stories, and I can see them so clearly in my mind. After a while, I can't always tell what I saw on television from what really happened." Lawson found Susan and David waiting in the hotel lobby, their faces expectant. The crushing weight of delivering this news sat heavily on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he began gently. "Mrs. Keller has a documented history of psychiatric issues. She's created a detailed fantasy based on news coverage of your son's case." "No," Susan shook her head vehemently. "She knew things, private things about the boys. How could she know about Michael's scar?" "The scar was mentioned in a newspaper feature last year. Lawson explained, showing them the article. Many of the details she provided were published in various media accounts. Susan's face crumpled, her body seeming to collapse inward as the last strand of hope snapped. David barely managed to catch her as she slipped into a catatonic state, her eyes open but unseeing. Within the hour, paramedics transported Susan to Renown Regional Medical Center in Reno, where psychiatrists diagnosed acute stress disorder triggered by prolonged trauma and dashed hopes. 3 days later, David sat beside Susan's hospital bed, the sterile white room a stark contrast to the colorful investigation boards she'd created. He placed one of the teddy bears in her limp hand. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you before," he whispered to her sedated form. "And I'm sorry this wasn't real." While Susan slowly recovered under medical supervision, Sheriff Jim Donovan sat in his doctor's office 200 miles away, receiving news that would forever alter his remaining time on the case. 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment, the oncologist explained, discussing the advanced lung cancer now spreading through his body. Instead of fear, Donovan's weathered face set with determination. He would use whatever time he had left to give the Reynolds family the answers they deserved. Sheriff Donovan left his doctor's office clutching the manila folder containing his test results and treatment options. Terminal lung cancer. 6 months, perhaps a year, with aggressive treatment. The weight of his mortality pressed down on his shoulders, but as he slid behind the wheel of his patrol car, his mind turned not to his own fate, but to the unfinished business that had haunted him for years, the Reynolds case. That evening, ignoring his doctor's advice to rest, Donovan pulled the Reynolds files from the station's archives. Under the yellow glow of his desk lamp, he spread photographs, witness statements, and evidence logs across his desk. If these were to be his final months of service, he would dedicate them to giving Susan and David the answers they had waited 5 long years to receive. "Jim, you should be at home," his deputy remarked, finding him asleep at his desk the next morning, surrounded by case files. "Can't take this one with me," Donovan replied, straightening in his chair and wincing at the pain in his chest. That weekend, his daughter Kelly returned from college to care for him. At 22, she was in her final year of criminology studies. Her career choice influenced by growing up watching her father's dedication to law enforcement. She found him asleep among piles of documents, his reading glasses still perched on his nose. Gently, she draped a blanket over his shoulders, her eyes catching sight of the familiar Reynolds case file. 2 days later, Donovan and Kelly visited Susan, who had recently returned home from the hospital. Her frame had grown thinner, her movements more deliberate, but her eyes still held a determined spark. "I need your help reviewing some details," Donovan said, setting his notebook on the kitchen table. "My memory isn't what it used to be." It was a transparent excuse to involve her in the process, to give her purpose when hope had been so cruelly snatched away again. Susan's fingers traced the photographs of Tommy and Michael as Donovan and Kelly asked careful questions about routines, acquaintances, and details that might have seemed insignificant 5 years earlier, but could prove crucial with fresh perspective. Within weeks, Susan channeled her pain into something constructive. At the South Lake Tahoe City Hall, she filed paperwork to officially register the Mountain Children's Search Network, her hands steady as she signed the documents. "What exactly does your organization do?" asked the city clerk, stamping the forms. "We support families of missing children," Susan explained. "No one should have to navigate this nightmare alone, without resources or guidance." David, hearing of Susan's initiative, offered his carpentry skills to renovate a small storefront donated by a local business owner to serve as the organization's headquarters. Though they were no longer a couple, they developed a comfortable rhythm working side by side, united by shared grief and purpose. "This corner would be perfect for a children's play area," Susan suggested as they stripped old wallpaper. "For the siblings of missing children, they're often forgotten victims." Meanwhile, Donovan re-interviewed key witnesses, including Jerry Carmichael, now the owner of White Feather Market, after purchasing it from Al Thompson. "Something's always bothered me," Donovan admitted, sitting in Carmichael's office. Walker wasn't scheduled to work that day. Why was he at the market? Carmichael frowned, considering this oversight. You're right. Thursday was his day off. I never thought about that. In Donovan's office, he and Kelly created an elaborate timeline on a blank wall, using red string to connect events, highlighting inconsistencies and overlooked details. His colleagues watched with concern, as the sheriff worked tirelessly, despite his declining health, occasionally disappearing for chemotherapy appointments, only to return with case files tucked under his arm. By autumn, Susan conducted her first support group meeting for families with missing children. 5 local families gathered in the newly renovated center, sharing their experiences as Susan guided the conversation. The uncertainty is the hardest part, she told them, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. We must learn to live with unanswered questions while never stopping our search for truth. During a particularly difficult chemotherapy session in November, Donovan continued reviewing files, ignoring the nausea as toxic medications dripped into his veins. Sheriff, you really should rest during treatment, the nurse suggested gently, adjusting his IV. I'm racing against 2 clocks now, he replied with a weak smile, and I'm not sure which will run out first. By December, Susan had transformed the boys' bedroom into a partial office for her organization, though she couldn't bring herself to remove the beds completely. Tommy's model airplanes still hung from the ceiling, but beneath them stood a desk covered with correspondence from families seeking help, a symbolic bridge between her past and her uncertain future. As Christmas approached, Donovan's condition deteriorated rapidly. Confined to his home, he requested Susan visit him one final time. His hands, once strong enough to restrain violent suspects, now trembled as he handed her a leather-bound folder. These are my personal notes, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Theories I could never officially pursue, connections I couldn't prove. Don't let them be forgotten. In February of 1996, Sheriff James Donovan was laid to rest in South Lake Tahoe Cemetery. The church overflowed with uniformed officers and community members, their breath visible in the winter air as they gathered to honor the man who had served them for nearly 3 decades. Susan and David sat side by side in the front pew, no longer as husband and wife, but as companions united by loss. After the service, as mourners dispersed across the snow-covered cemetery, Kelly Donovan approached Susan, her father's determination evident in her stance. My father never forgot Tommy and Michael, she said, taking Susan's gloved hands in hers. And neither will I. When I have the resources and position, I promise I'll reopen this case. In early January 2019, Detective Kelly Donovan unlocked a dust-covered storage room in the basement of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she located the shelves containing the Reynolds case files. No one's touched these in years, remarked the evidence clerk, helping her load several cardboard boxes onto a cart. They will now, Kelly replied, her father's determination evident in her voice. At 45, she had fulfilled her promise, rising through the ranks to become a detective in the same department where Sheriff Jim Donovan had served. The moment she secured enough authority and resources, she had petitioned to officially reopen the case that had consumed her father's final days. In her newly assigned office, Kelly installed specialized software to digitize 3 decades of paperwork. Photographs of Tommy and Michael Reynolds stared back from her computer screen as she meticulously cataloged every interview, sighting, and lead. Modern technology would help her see connections that might have been impossible to detect in the 1980s. Jerry Carmichael, now a successful businessman who owned a chain of gas stations throughout the region, sat across from Kelly in his wood-paneled office. Gray had replaced the sandy hair he'd had as a teenage clerk. I never forgot those boys, he said, staring into his coffee cup. Always wondered what happened when those Twinkies and sodas sat on the counter all afternoon. 37 years later, I still think about it. Across town, Kelly knocked on the door of a modest bungalow. Susan Reynolds, 72 years old with snow-white hair, but still piercing blue eyes, opened the door. The Mountain Children's Search Network had become her life's work, helping dozens of families navigate the nightmare she had lived. "You look just like your father," Susan said, inviting Kelly inside. "He would be proud of you." Using facial recognition software and advanced database mining, Kelly traced Gerald Walker's employment history across 4 states. A pattern emerged that confirmed her father's suspicions. Walker had worked in small establishments in each town, where similar disappearances occurred between 1975 and 1985. In March, Kelly traveled to Phoenix, where records indicated Gerald Walker now resided in a nursing home following a severe stroke. She found a frail 78-year-old man, partially paralyzed, but with unnervingly alert eyes. Presenting herself as conducting routine follow-ups on cold cases, she carefully observed his reactions to photographs and questions about Lake Tahoe. "Something about his eyes changed when I mentioned the Reynolds boys," Kelly told her partner upon returning, like a light switching on behind them. 2 weeks later, her office phone rang at 3 in the morning. A construction foreman in Strawberry, California, a small community between South Lake Tahoe and Placerville on Interstate 50, had discovered human remains while excavating for a new shopping center. "We hit something weird," the man explained, his voice shaking. "Looks like some kind of burial site, multiple bodies arranged in a circle." By dawn, Kelly stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as forensic anthropologists carefully unearthed 7 distinct sets of remains. The skeletons, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate circular pattern, were those of children, based on their size and development. "We'll need DNA comparison," the lead anthropologist advised, carefully brushing dirt from a small skull. "But preliminary examination suggests these remains have been here since the early 1980s. 2 agonizing weeks passed while the lab processed DNA samples from the remains, comparing them with genetic material preserved from Tommy and Michael's possessions. When Kelly's phone rang with the results, she closed her eyes briefly before answering. "We have positive identification on 2 of the sets of remains," the technician confirmed. "They match the profiles for Thomas and Michael Reynolds." Kelly drove to Susan's home that evening, dreading the conversation ahead. How do you tell a mother that the children she's searched for across 4 decades are confirmed dead? Yet when Kelly delivered the news, Susan's reaction surprised her. Instead of collapsing in grief, the elderly woman nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over her features. "I always knew, somewhere deep in my heart," Susan said, reaching for Kelly's hand. "Now I can bury them properly. I can visit a real place, not just memories." Property records revealed that the land where the remains were found had belonged to a Gerald W. Thompson between 1978 and 1986, an alias Walker had evidently used. With this discovery, Kelly secured a search warrant for the cabin that still stood on the property, now owned by an unsuspecting young couple. In the basement, behind a false wall panel, investigators discovered a metal box containing a meticulously kept journal and Polaroid photographs of children, including Tommy and Michael Reynolds. The handwritten entries described in disturbing detail how Walker selected and approached his victims. "The blonde boys came alone today," one entry read. "Promised to show them wolf pups at my mountain property." Their blue eyes brightened with excitement. The older one hesitated, but the younger one convinced him. Armed with this evidence, Kelly returned to Phoenix with an arrest warrant. Despite his physical condition, prosecutors decided to proceed with the case against Gerald Walker, citing the heinous nature of his crimes and the need for justice for 7 families who had waited decades for answers. At the trial in October, Susan sat stoically in the front row, watching the wheelchair-bound man who had destroyed her family. Walker's frail appearance contrasted sharply with the calculated predator revealed through evidence. Against his attorney's advice, Walker chose to testify, admitting to the killings with chilling detachment. "They were perfect," he explained without remorse. "Golden hair like sunshine, blue eyes like the sky. I preserved them in their perfection, before the world could corrupt them." On November 26, 2019, 37 years after they vanished, Tommy and Michael Reynolds were finally laid to rest in South Lake Tahoe Cemetery. Hundreds of community members attended the service, many of whom hadn't even been born when the boys disappeared, but had grown up knowing their story. One autumn afternoon a year later, Susan visited the grave site, placing between the twin headstones the two teddy bears she had kept for decades. As she slowly walked away, she noticed a young mother with two blonde boys playing happily under nearby trees, a bittersweet reminder that life continues and that even in the darkest circumstances, some form of peace and closure can eventually be found.